Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today is a bit different. We are going to have a special focus on Afghanistan. The situation there has been all over the media. It's been on all of our minds. Our Executive Director, Chris Costa, recently wrote an opinion piece about it, which we will share with you later on through the chat. Joining Chris today is Ali Nazary, Head of Foreign Relations for the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan. Forgive me, everyone. I've been a little bit sick. So sorry. Just a little background on the NRF. This is a military alliance of former Northern Alliance members and other anti-Taliban fighters who remain loyal to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. It was created after the 2021 Taliban offensive under the leadership of Afghan politician and military leader Ahmad Massoud. Nazary's role with NRF grows from his deep roots in Afghanistan. He has been a TV host on Khorasan TV, director of media affairs for Abdullah's 2014 presidential campaign, and now he is a specialist on Afghan and Central Asian government relations at Bellwether Partners. In 2016, he also became president of the Massoud Foundation USA, the North American branch of the Massoud Foundation of Afghanistan. And I am sorry for really ruining all my pronunciations with my coughing attack. Please forgive me. After Chris and Ali share their views on what is happening in Afghanistan, we'll turn the program over to your questions. Now over to you, Chris. I know you're going to do a better job than I just did.
No, first of all, Happy New Year, everyone. We are really excited about this program in particular, and I'm excited to have Ali here today. But I also want to doubly thank Amanda because she's been under the weather and she insisted on working today, even though she has a need to overhydrate today or hydrate more as a result of the cold that she's trying to shake. So all of that said, we're really excited about this program. As Amanda said, we want to zero in on the important story playing out in Afghanistan. And that story for me started many years ago, but this summer, of course, it got all of our attention, in particular way back in August. And in August, the first article that got my attention on the NRF was published by Ahmad Massoud himself, who published an op-ed in the Washington Post about the aim of the NRF, the Northern Resistance Front, and particularly focused on the idea that the resistance began in August. I encourage you to dig out and find that particular opinion piece, but I know that Ali is prepared to talk about it. Now, you might know that Ahmad Massoud, as the son of the Lion of Panjshir, the commander, the famed commander, Ahmad Shah Massoud. Now, you might remember that on the eve of 9/11, Al-Qaeda sent a team to kill Massoud, to assassinate him. Why did Al-Qaeda do that? Because Massoud posed a significant threat to Al-Qaeda. And of course, on September 9th, 2001, bin Laden knew what was going to happen a mere 48 hours later when the World Trade Towers were going to be attacked. So he wanted to take away one of the key fighters that would oppose him. So certainly that op-ed got my attention this past summer, and I've been able to build a relationship with Ali. So we will talk to him about what is happening on the ground right now in Afghanistan, particularly because there is a humanitarian crisis that's looming. That's part of what my op-ed talks about, but it also talks about what I think are some reasonable solutions, or at least something that Western coalitions can ponder. So again, the theme of today's discussion is really about the possibility for a significant humanitarian crisis, meaning food stuff not getting to the population, the Taliban inadequately distributing all of those food as well as medical supplies across Afghanistan, not just selectively to Pashtuns, for example, but to make sure some ethnic minorities receive the same level of support. So many are very concerned with this looming crisis. And again, we are interested in hearing from Ali to share some perspectives based on his interactions with people on the ground right now in Afghanistan. The other piece of news that got my attention really relates to the idea of over-the-horizon intelligence. I know we talked about this with General Petraeus in September and certainly in August as the US withdrawal played out. But the idea that the US will have inadequate intelligence capabilities without human intelligence on the ground. And that's why, again, I encourage our audience to ask in questions and answers what a humanitarian operation supported by a coalition, how might that contribute to providing intelligence on perhaps growth of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, growth of ISIS-K, and I know Ali is also going to talk about his concerns regarding that growth and the need for Western intelligence to understand how that network continues to grow without having a footprint on the ground. In other words, how is the US going to do that adequately, employing an over-the-horizon strategy? Many pundits have talked about that, and certainly we have discussed it seriously in this forum. From a counterintelligence standpoint, an article in the Wall Street Journal got my attention. The title was this, of the headline: Taliban covert operation seized Kabul, other Afghan cities from within. What's important to note is the Wall Street Journal article chronicled this idea that the Taliban, many of them shaved off their beards, and they were able to move into cities to do clandestine fundraising, to conduct propaganda and recruitment. In other words, to build a bit of a fifth column. So when folks question, how did Afghanistan fall so quickly? There are lots of opinions on that, but one opinion that needs to be factored in is this idea that the Taliban were able to conduct a fifth column movement to essentially do what's in the US Special Operations playbook and build an underground network and then activate that network at an appropriate time. So certainly we can discuss that as well. And I think one of the last stories that got my attention, and this is late fall, early December, and some of that is still playing out on the ground in Afghanistan, but it hasn't been reported on widely, and that is the idea that Taliban has repositioned their fighters to the northeast in places like Jalalabad and also Nangarhar province, really a tough nut to crack to fight in that ground. And the Taliban is now sending their fighters there to fight against ISIS Khorasan. Of course, ISIS Khorasan is a terrorist organization that the United States and other Western intelligence agencies are very concerned with as this conflict plays out. So we continue to watch that, to measure the growth of ISIS-K and also how successful the Taliban is going to be against marshaling their forces against ISIS-K. And I think lastly, I want to note that there is still a US hostage to be sure on the ground. Another article was published on Mark Frericks in the Washington Examiner, I think just last week, that reminded the world that there still is a US hostage who is likely being held by the Haqqani network, a US citizen by the name of Mark Frericks, a US contractor. And of course, there are other dual citizens that are trying to get out of Afghanistan still. The amount, the number for me is really hard to pin down of how many dual citizens are trying to get out of Afghanistan still. So I'd like to turn it over to Ali to provide some context for some of the articles that I just talked about. And Ali knows that I have two big questions. The first question is, what is happening on the ground in Afghanistan? Can he provide us some context? And is he concerned, like I am, about an impending humanitarian disaster? Winter is upon the population in Afghanistan. Starvation is rife right now. Medicine supplies are in short demand. Is he as worried that as I am about the humanitarian crisis and also the future security challenges? So that's a lot, Ali, but I'm kicking it over to you because we really want to hear your perspectives.
Thank you very much, Chris. First of all, I would like to thank Amanda, Hannah, and the whole Spy Museum for inviting me to your program and giving me time to explain the situation in Afghanistan, especially our efforts, the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan's efforts inside and outside of the country. In regards to the situation, first of all, I would like to explain a bit what the NRF is, the National Resistance Front, and then explain the situation and what our efforts in all of this today is, what sort of role we have. The National Resistance Front of Afghanistan was formed on August 15th during the day that the Taliban entered Kabul. The whole political class, political figures, and political parties went into exile. Everyone who was part of the past 20 years, politically involved in the past 20 years, went into exile. They didn't have the will to resist. A few of them stayed in Kabul and were interested in working with the Taliban. But there was one individual who made a different decision, and that was Commander Ahmad Massoud, the son of the late Ahmad Shah Massoud, who said, I'm going to stay in my country and I'm going to continue resisting against international terrorism, continue working for democracy, freedom, and the rights of every single citizen of the country. And I am not going to allow a terrorist group to come and hijack Afghanistan. So he went from Kabul to Panjshir, boarded a helicopter. When he arrived there, the remnants of the ANDSF, the Afghanistan's armed forces, they also came, the ones that didn't want to surrender, the ones that didn't want to flee, they came to Panjshir, mostly the special forces and the commandos who were trained by the United States and other NATO countries in the past 20 years. You had the locals, the local resistance fighters from many provinces, and including Panjshir, and just ordinary citizens who coalesced around him, and they declared a new resistance against international terrorism. And this is how the National Resistance Front came into being, and everyone declared their support and their allegiance to Ahmad Massoud. Our resistance has three components. One is the military resistance, which has been going on since late August. Today, we've expanded to 7 provinces. We have pockets of resistance in 7 provinces in Afghanistan, including Kabul province, and we are growing every day in numbers. And these are the people who we recruit, and the people who join us are mostly people who were part of the ANDSF. They're officers and forces, soldiers who were trained by the United States and NATO in the past 20 years, and they want to return to their campaign, their struggle against terrorism. And now, since they see a new purpose, a new leadership, and a clear vision for Afghanistan's future, they're willing to join the resistance. So for the past few months, we've been getting more recruits from the former soldiers and officers. And today they're all over the Hindu Kush security belts, and it's growing every day, and we're expanding to more provinces. The other front is our political fronts. We've been challenging the Taliban politically outside of Afghanistan, diplomatically outside of Afghanistan. We've been doing everything that we could to prevent any sort of recognition or legitimacy for the Taliban, regionally and internationally. And we are continuing our efforts And we will be increasing our efforts to prove that the Taliban will never be able to represent Afghanistan and its citizens. The Taliban is still a terrorist group. It's a crime syndicate. And this group can never and will never represent the interests of Afghanistan's people. So it should never receive legitimacy, and it should never receive recognition from anyone, because they do not represent us. They don't represent our interests. And our third front is our civil resistance. And this is growing every day too. It's mostly in the cities. Right now in Kabul and Herat and Mazar, and even in the rural areas, you see especially women coming out on the streets every day, protesting against the Taliban, saying these people do not represent us. We don't want these people in power. We want our freedom. We want our rights as human beings. And the civil resistance is also growing every day that passes, especially in the cities and outside of Afghanistan too. For the past 6 months, our diaspora communities throughout the world has launched protests, organized demonstrations to show that they do not support terrorists controlling their country, and that the international community should do all it could to prevent such a group to continue oppressing Afghanistan's people and creating a terrorist safe haven out of Afghanistan. So this is the NRF, and our vision for Afghanistan is to reestablish democracy in the country. We believe that in the 21st century, democracy has no alternative. There is no alternative to democracy. And the past 6 months has shown that the vast majority in Afghanistan, they support democracy. They don't support a system that belongs to the 15th century, the so-called Islamic Emirates. And they haven't shown any support for this Islamic Emirate that has hijacked the country right now. And so our vision for the country is the reestablishment of democracy. However, a new democratic model, one that's based on Afghanistan's realities. Afghanistan is a country made up of ethnic minorities. Unfortunately, in the past 20 years, we did not realize these realities about Afghanistan's social makeup. This is why the political system that came into being was never perceived as a legitimate one to the overall population, because they did not see themselves in decision-making and policy-making. And for this reason, the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan believes in a federated Afghanistan. A federated Afghanistan could be much more democratic than any other type of political system, because power will be distributed to everyone, to all citizens, regardless of race, religion, and gender. All of the ethnic groups will see themselves in decision-making and policy-making, and will see themselves in power. And Afghanistan is the most diverse country in Asia right now. It's a country made up of ethnic minorities. It's one of the rare countries in the world where you don't have a majority. Everyone is a minority in the country. So you cannot have one ethnic group or one political force dominating politics. This is why we believe if we want lasting peace in the country, if we want a strong democracy in the country, we will need some sort of federalism in Afghanistan's future. And overall, the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan believes that international terrorism still exists, and that we should continue the international war on terror that started on September 2001. Unfortunately, the war on terror did not end in September 2021. In September 2021, what happened is that the international war on terror continued. However, our allies, the United States and other NATO countries, they abandoned the war on terror. So we perceive ourselves as the last remaining democratic forces, as the last remaining Western allies, and as the last remaining anti-terrorist forces, continuing the war on terror all alone, abandoned after September 2021, because international terrorism has increased its presence in the past few years, especially in the past 6 months, which I will be getting into a bit later. So this is the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, led by Ahmad Massoud. When it comes to the current situation on the ground, Unfortunately, Afghanistan is suffering its worst humanitarian crisis ever. We've never faced such a humanitarian crisis in the past 40, 50 years. Starvation is increasing every day. And the main reason why we have a humanitarian crisis is because we have a terrorist group in power today. It's not because $10 billion is frozen or that no one is working with the Taliban or recognizing them or giving them legitimacy. The reason we have a humanitarian crisis in the country is because you have these people in power, because one, they're incompetent. They were not made to become statesmen, state builders. They're not professionals, they're not technocrats. They don't know how to run a banking system. They don't know how to run an economy or run other state institutions. They were made for one purpose, and that was destruction. And they're continuing that. So one reason why we have this humanitarian crisis is because of the Taliban. Two, the Taliban do not have any intention to end such a crisis themselves. They don't believe it's their responsibility. They haven't done any actions to alleviate the suffering of Afghanistan's people. And their actions are not based on the interests of Afghanistan citizens. It's based on their group's interests, like any terrorist group, like any criminal organization. It's only based on their interests. And there's many examples that I can give. For example, their so-called prime minister last month came on national TV, and he said, our responsibility and duty was jihad against foreign forces and the government in Kabul, but we defeated both, and our responsibility to the people has ended. The responsibility to provide for the people and to feed the people is not ours. It's not our duty. It's God's duty. And so people have to ask God, they have to pray to God. They shouldn't ask us to feed them. So this is their mindset, their mentality, that they're not responsible to address the problems, the crises of the country, and to provide for the people. And as long as we have the Taliban in power and they're in control of the country, we will have a humanitarian crisis, whether we give $100 million of assistance or $10 billion of assistance. It doesn't matter. And right now, with the situation on the ground with international organizations providing, we see a lot of problems. One, right now, the cash and food that's going into the country, a large percentage is taken directly from international organizations and others by the Taliban for themselves. And then what happens is international organizations right now, they subcontract local organizations, local NGOs. And what has happened is since August 15th, the impartial local NGOs, all of them went into exile. The local NGOs that stayed on, the vast majority of them, had links, strong links with the Taliban and Pakistan's ISI before August 15th, and they were aligned with them. And many of them did exist even in the 1990s when the Taliban were in Kabul. And they stayed on after August 15th. And these are the local NGOs that are being hired today. And what these local NGOs do is, since they're influenced by the Taliban, they have strong links with the Taliban, they distribute aid in areas where the Taliban enjoy supporting. So there's a discrimination on how aid is distributed throughout the country. You have neighborhoods in Kabul that are not receiving aid. You have many provinces throughout the country not receiving aid or any type of assistance. And most of the aid is being concentrated in specific areas, especially those areas that the Taliban are supported and they enjoy supporting. So this is a problem. And by just sending as much cash as possible, it's not going to alleviate this. It's not going to end a humanitarian crisis. We should address the root cause of the humanitarian crisis, which is the Taliban themselves. Besides the humanitarian crisis, we're seeing a security crisis increase inside Afghanistan, which is not only going to impact Afghanistan's security in the months to come and the years to come, or the region's security, but it's going to threaten global security. For the past 6 months, we've seen a drastic increase of foreign fighters of terrorist groups coming from North Africa, coming from the Middle East, coming from South Asia, Central Asia, and many other parts of the world. There's around 13 to 14,000 foreign fighters in Afghanistan right now. And the vast majority of these fighters are from groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda. They're Al-Qaeda fighters. Just 6,000 of these fighters are based in northeastern Afghanistan, along Afghanistan's border with Tajikistan. The Taliban have handed over the security of Afghanistan's border with Tajikistan to 6,000 terrorist fighters. And these terrorist fighters are affiliated with two groups. One is called the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, and the second is Jamaat Ansarullah, which is made up of Tajik nationals. And these are people who went to Iraq and Syria, received training, and they've returned to the region through Pakistan, and they're in northern Afghanistan. And you have many other fighters throughout the country. And another thing that the Taliban is doing for these terrorist groups is they're distributing passports and ID cards. Instead of distributing passports to Afghanistan citizens, they're distributing passports and identification to terrorists from all over the world to legitimize their presence inside Afghanistan. The passport agency in Kabul right now is controlled by the Haqqani network. The head of the passport agency is part of the Haqqani family. He's a Haqqani himself. And they're distributing passports and ID cards. And this is going to be a scary risk for all countries, because you will have these foreign fighters join these mass migrations, whether eastwards or westwards, with ID cards from Afghanistan and passport from Afghanistan. They'll act as if they're a citizen of that country. And they'll infiltrate in many societies, especially into Western countries. Third, the leadership of Al-Qaeda has returned in the past 6 months. We saw in early September that Amin al-Haq, a close aide, a senior aide of bin Laden, returned to Afghanistan. He received a hero's welcome from the Taliban. It was a public event. They weren't even hiding it. We have strong reports that Ayman al-Zawahiri has been in Afghanistan. He might be traveling from Afghanistan to the neighboring country, but to Pakistan. But we had reports that he was in Afghanistan and he might still be there. And third, the Taliban have appointed a well-known Al-Qaeda leader who's part of UN's Al-Qaeda sanctions list, not the Taliban's sanctions list, but the Al-Qaeda sanctions list. His name is Ihsanullah Barial. He's a well-known Al-Qaeda member, and the Taliban have appointed him as Kabul province's governor. So he's governor of Kabul province, appointed by the Taliban. As you could see, the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is intertwined. They can never divorce this group. They can never sever their ties with this group. And the calculations made by many in the US government and many other countries that they might distance themselves from Al-Qaeda, this is impossible. And they will never act against Al-Qaeda. And the reason is very clear. The sole source of legitimacy for the Taliban comes from Al-Qaeda, from these terrorist groups. The Taliban receive legitimacy from these terrorist groups. They don't receive legitimacy from elsewhere. Their main source of motivation is from these groups. These rank and file of the Taliban share the same ideology as the rank and file of Al-Qaeda. They believe in a global jihadist ideology, and they will never go against this. On August 16th, the day after the Taliban entered Kabul, every single terrorist group except for ISIS, from Boko Haram to Al-Shabaab in Africa, all the way to Lashkar-e-Taiba in South Asia, all of them congratulated the Taliban, declared the Taliban as the leaders of the Islamic cause, of the jihadist cause, and and congratulated them for setting an example for other Muslim movements or Islamic movements throughout the region. So it is impossible for the Taliban to become allies of the West, specifically the US, for counterterrorism, because they themselves are part of terrorism. On the other side, you have a growing threat from ISIS. So in Afghanistan, there's two types of ISIS. There's the ISIS-K, the local branch of ISIS that was formed 6-7 years ago. And they've been operating on both sides of the border in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they're the largest group of ISIS. But then you have a smaller group of ISIS that have come from Iraq and Syria. They're the ISIS of Iraq, they're the ISIS of Syria that are slowly coming into Afghanistan through Pakistan. And they're building their bases too. But they're smaller in numbers compared to Al-Qaeda. So the main threat inside Afghanistan is Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is trying to infiltrate into Central Asia right now. They have 6,000 fighters. Their overall fighters might be around 13,000, but they have 6,000 fighters along the border in the north, trying to infiltrate into Central Asia, and then start moving towards the Caucasus and Europe. And this is all being ignored. And the reason why Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all these terrorist groups are choosing Afghanistan over any other country, there's a few reasons. And this is why, as a last note before we move to questions, I would like to state is that the whole over-the-horizon strategy that is being proposed today, it's not going to work in Afghanistan. And this is why Al-Qaeda doesn't perceive over the horizon as a threat. Because in the past 20 years, one thing that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have realized is that their leadership cannot operate in the Middle East or North Africa. The Middle East's terrain, geography, North Africa's geography is not suitable for their leadership to base themselves in, to plan and facilitate attacks, because it's flat, it's desert, and if over the horizon strategy will work there. It's easy to target them from the air. But the same is in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, it has a very rugged terrain, as Chris definitely knows. It has strategic valleys, and anyone who bases themselves in the Hindu Kush, we have that experience for the past 50 years. Anyone who bases themselves in the Hindu Kush, it's very difficult to go after them, especially through aerial attacks. You definitely need people on the ground to go after terrorism in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda and ISIS knows this, that if they use Afghanistan, and there isn't any Western ally, there isn't any anti-terrorist forces inside Afghanistan, then they could operate for years, plan and facilitate attacks for years, and control all their cells and all their pockets of fighters throughout the region and throughout the globe. So this is a problem when it comes to over the horizon, and this is a problem when it comes to the current strategy of not helping the last remaining democratic forces, the last remaining Western allies, and the last remaining anti-terrorist forces in the country. Because if the National Resistance Front is unable to survive in a year or 2 or 3, and then you have a greater threat than what is in Afghanistan today, and it has to be addressed, then you won't have allies on the ground in a few years, like the US had in 2001, or the US had allies in Iraq in 2014 that allowed some sort of counterterrorism to happen.
Ali, that was brilliant and extremely educational, I think, for our audience. We want to jump into questions and answers. I'm going to kick it over to Amanda. I wish we had a 2-hour program today because we have many, many questions, but we will get to them, and we'll try to be as succinct as possible with our answers. And between the two of us, I think we'll be able to tackle all of them. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. And some of these may be redundant a little bit, but please, just to give people a bulleted answer, there are very comprehensive questions, and we're getting them in email and through our Q&A here. We have a former UK law enforcement intelligence analyst who attends a lot, and he worked in Central Asia and Pakistan, and he is wondering, what is the attitude of Pakistan, especially the ISI, to your military, political, and civil resistance programs?
So the attitude of Pakistan has always, there has been duplicity in Pakistan's policies, as we all know. The past 20 years, their relations with both Afghanistan's government and the United States has proven this. And their policies are still not good. Well, one thing that is clear that they are continuing their support for the Taliban. Pakistan is the main sponsor of the Taliban today, and they're trying their best to convince countries to recognize these terrorists in Kabul. So they haven't withdrawn support from the Taliban. When it comes to these terrorist groups, once again, all these terrorist groups are using Pakistani soil to enter Afghanistan. They're not entering from any other country. They're entering from Pakistan into Afghanistan. And this is why many Central Asian countries are concerned, not only when it comes to the Taliban, but Pakistan's attitude towards terrorism today, or the other regional countries. Because Pakistan, once again, is not only sponsoring the Taliban, they're sponsoring international terrorism. And this is going to backfire because now we have many small groups in Pakistan attacking the Pakistani establishment as well. There has been around 3 to 5 Pakistani soldiers are killed on a daily basis. There's the TTP that have revived itself. They're using Afghanistan, and so the situation in the region is becoming more complex. Even though Pakistan is still continuing its support for the Taliban international terrorism, but we're even seeing some activities against Pakistan, and this is very concerning because if we see destabilization in Pakistan, instability in Pakistan, those nuclear weapons might fall into the wrong hands. So this is another reason for concern, and we should have a watchful eye when it comes to the developments in Pakistan as well.
Sort of a question while we're in geography. Given the terrain, is there a fear that the Taliban forces could isolate the Panjshir Valley and you just kind of shut down supplies and commerce?
So they've been doing this. Well, one reason why after a month of resisting them through a conventional war strategy, the resistance for the first month was a conventional resistance or war against the Taliban. And then we realized because Panjshir was isolated, and basically the international community ignored us, there was nothing else to do. So we changed our strategy from a conventional war to a guerrilla war, to an unconventional war. So we withdrew from the main valley of Panjshir to the side valleys. But today we control 60% of Panjshir. And it's like the situation back in the 1980s with the Soviets. The Soviets would come in to the main valley of Panjshir, but we would be in the side valleys and we would attack them from there, and they would be defeated. The same is happening today, and we're able to get in supplies for the side valleys at the moment. But in the future, once we clear the whole province, we might run into difficulties. This is why we're operating in other provinces too. So this time around, not only will we liberate Panjshir, but many other provinces too.
Do you think NRF will be able to accomplish goals without an actual large-scale war?
So when it comes to the Taliban, it's very difficult to convince them to accept a political settlement based on these values. They are a criminal organization, like any other criminal organization. They're a terrorist group. They're involved in human trafficking today, drug trafficking, antiquity trafficking. They're oppressing Afghanistan's general population, ordinary citizens, women, children. They're abducting women and children today. There's many cases, and we have all of them, many of them. Just yesterday, a few days ago in the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva, 36 experts, UN human rights experts, declared that the Taliban are erasing women from public life. And this isn't a group to be changed through only civil resistance. We are pursuing political and civil resistance. But a military resistance is needed because this is a terrorist group. This is a criminal organization, and if there is no military pressure on them, they will not be contained, they will never be defeated. This is why our military operations is very, very important. And once again, it's not only the Taliban. You have international terrorism in Afghanistan. We're fighting against all of them today, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's the Taliban. In early September, when the Taliban launched its operations against Panjshir, there were more than 500 Al-Qaeda fighters in their ranks. And I have videos of them. I've posted videos of these on my social media platform on Twitter, showing Arab-speaking fighters from the Middle East. Afghanistan doesn't have any Arab speakers. It's a Arabic-speaking country. He had Arabic-speaking fighters telling on camera, saying, we're going to the front to Panjshir to kill infidels, to fight against infidels. They were considering us infidels. And I posted these videos. This is why I don't characterize the current fight as a civil war in Afghanistan. It's not a civil war. No, when we're fighting Central Asians, South Asians, Middle Easterns, North Africa, all these people affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we cannot characterize it as a civil war. This is why I keep saying it's the continuation of the war on terror, international war on terror. It's just that the international community, especially the US and NATO, has abandoned this fight. And we're all alone, abandoned, continuing the struggle against terrorism.
Well, this plays into a question from one of Chris's and my favorite viewers, who is a young girl with the greatest questions. Hi, Rose. And you see that smile from Chris there. It's a tough question, though. Rose wants to know what you think the United States could have done differently to ensure a smoother exit from Afghanistan.
So if I could jump in there, we'll give Ali a
Sure.
break just for a moment. Great question, Rose. And I promised myself that I don't want to be in a position to continually relitigate a decision that was made back in August, but we can, for the sake of this discussion. I could make the point, and I did previously, so I'll do it again today. I believe we could have left a smaller footprint of US military forces on the ground, much like Iraq. That becomes a strong symbol to the people of Afghanistan. It reinforces and underscores a commitment. And certainly what we needed to do is to ensure that we continued the pipeline support, the logistic support to the Afghan Air Force. And by having a small US footprint, which exists today in Iraq, that is the model in Iraq. That's gone through the pains of having zero footprint of US military forces and then a reintroduction after the birth of ISIS. That's another story. But I think a smaller footprint, and I will say that leaving Bagram Air Base at the time, this sounds very tactical, but it really was a strategic decision. We gave up some significant terrain that we could have continued logistical support and could have maintained a foothold. Now, this is going to be argued back and forth for many, many years to come. So I'd kind of like to flash forward to what we could do differently. And then I'm going to turn back to Ali to hear his perspectives. But what we could do is reflect on a coalition history that goes back to 1991. And that's what I wrote about in an op-ed. And I want the viewers to read it, make your own assessment. But the idea of a small foothold today in Afghanistan, a safe zone where we can bring in foodstuffs that are distributed across the country, is possible. We did that, we being a coalition, a huge coalition, did that in the immediate aftermath of the first Iraq War. So there was a swift victory, and then there was an epic humanitarian crisis where millions crossed the border into Turkey and were hunted down by Saddam Hussein's remnants of the security services. But the United States, along with coalition partners, exercised a massive humanitarian effort called Provide Comfort. But the concept can be applied in a much smaller scale in Afghanistan if The money that's released doesn't ensure distribution. If the UN is unable to ensure distribution, and we heard from Ali, his perspectives are very downbeat on that. Mine are starting to become extremely pessimistic. So that said, there are opportunities to establish safe zones, havens on the ground in sovereign Afghanistan. We did that in Iraq, we being, again, a Western coalition, did that in 1991 after some bad decisions were made by President H.W. Bush. He sent unintended signals for the Kurds to rise up, and the Kurds rose up and they were slaughtered by Saddam Hussein's forces and then crossed into Turkey, and it created a significant humanitarian crisis. We're not there yet from a refugee standpoint, but the winter has just begun. So I think there are opportunities for the West to look at creative ways from our history, our collective history, to figure out how humanitarian aid gets distributed across Afghanistan, because fundamentally, I do not trust the Taliban to ensure the Hazaris, the Panshiris, the Uzbeks, they receive the same attention that Pashtuns will, and people aligned to the current Taliban-led government. So that's a long-winded answer to a very, very important question, Rose. Thank you. Ali, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, thank you very much, Chris, for clearly explaining this, and I concur with you on all of them. There's one thing, I myself and the leadership of the National Resistance Front and other members, we respect the US's decision of withdrawing, but we think it could have been much better than what happened. One thing was the timeline of the withdrawal. It was the worst possible time to withdraw from Afghanistan, beginning of the fighting season and ending towards the middle of the fighting season. And it would have been much better if it started in the middle of the fighting season, so towards August, September, and ended towards the end of the fighting season, beginning of winter. That would have stabilized conditions. That would have given the ANDSF time to fill the vacuum and void created by the withdrawal. And it would have been impossible for these terrorists to just launch a blitzkrieg throughout the country and take over Afghanistan. So that's one thing that I wanted to add that could have prevented the catastrophe we saw in Afghanistan after August. But yes, I believe it could have been much better. And the United States in the past 6-7 years was not in a combat mission in Afghanistan. It wasn't a combat mission. There weren't any Americans in the battlefield fighting against the Taliban and other terrorists. It was a stabilizing, the US presence had a stabilizing effect. And it was mostly a peacekeeping mission. It kept the peace. It kept the stability that was in place. And we saw once the US saw it pulling out, what happened? That it just destabilized the country. So, and what the United States was spending in Afghanistan was much less than many other countries that it has presence in. It had its largest base in Central Asia, and even there were people in the administration that said we want to return to great power politics or great power competition, and it didn't make sense for me to leave its largest base in the western border of China and allow a void and vacuum to be created for other great powers to fill in. So for us, even though we respect the decision, it just didn't make sense. And I believe that the way the US left, it will create much worse conditions in Afghanistan than what happened in Iraq in 2013 and 2014. Because the American pullout in Iraq created insecurities too afterwards, especially starting from 2012 onwards. it's going to be much worse in Afghanistan and much greater in scale and much more difficult to counter this if those solutions that Chris stated are not implemented. And we have a short window of opportunity to implement these solutions, or else it's going to close upon us.
What else do we have, Amanda?
Well, on all fronts, email, questions from my colleagues, our colleagues at the Spy Museum, everyone wants to know, what can an ordinary listener, citizen do to help? Where can we, and also, where can we turn to for information? You know, most of us just speak English, unfortunately.
I believe there's a few things. One is, I believe the ordinary citizen here in the US has to reach out to their representatives, their senators, to ask them to keep Afghanistan in their radar, and that the situation in Afghanistan, what happens in Afghanistan, isn't going to stay in Afghanistan. It's going to impact global security. And just ignoring Afghanistan isn't going to fix the problem, because the US ignored Afghanistan from 1992 to 2001. And by ignoring Afghanistan during that period, it allowed terrorism to base itself from Afghanistan, to create a sanctuary in Afghanistan, and to plan attacks such as 9/11. And today, international terrorism is much stronger than it was in the 1990s. It has more right now, everything that the US gave to Afghanistan is with the Taliban, and the Taliban have equipped Al-Qaeda with US-made gear, US-made weapons, US-made vehicles. And so they're using US weapons today to plan attacks against the West. One. Two, today, Al-Qaeda and all the other terrorist groups are emboldened because they have a precedence of fighting and their jihad continuing until they bring the other side, their enemy, to the negotiating table, and receiving as much concessions as they can, receiving legitimacy from them. And thirdly, they have this narrative that they have defeated the US and NATO in the 1990s. They didn't have this narrative. And there was this narrative of invincibility, that the US is invincible or NATO is invincible. But today, what happened in Afghanistan is they believe they can defeat NATO and that they can continue their insurgency, their terrorist activities, as long as possible until they're able to achieve what they achieved in Afghanistan elsewhere. So it's very important for Americans to have this in mind and to convince their politicians, their decision makers, their policymakers, that Afghanistan should not be ignored. Because if it's ignored, then this will, instead of the first line of defense for the free world being in Afghanistan, it will be in Western Europe, it will be in North America in the future. So in order to prevent that from happening, we have to have involvement in Afghanistan and prevent terrorism from rising once more.
All right, well, I want to invite Chris to take us to a slightly different place, just because he always has a reading suggestion for the audience. And it's an interesting one this month, and not quite on Afghanistan, but I bet you can weave it in somehow, Chris.
Well, first of all, let me just say, Ali, again, that was tremendous. I would just add on, one of the things we like to do at the International Spy Museum, it's our core mission, is to educate the public and allow a platform where people like Ali and me and our audience, we're not screaming at each other, we're trying to educate the public. And I think that's the first line of defense. The first thing this audience can do is bring others to the forum, get people involved, to learn, to be educated about these critical national security, international security issues. So I think that is our role. So keep telling people about Spy Chat, and we'll keep doing them. So let me transition, as I don't know if anybody here remembers Monty Python. Now for something completely different, I want to offer a book recommendation, and I want to tell a very, very quick story on how I first heard the presentation from the author. The author is Amy Herman. The presentation was done at a museum in New York City, at an art museum. I think the Museum of Art in New York City, the Metropolitan, if I'm not mistaken. But any event, the forum was to listen to an hour class on how seeing your world through art can hone your observation skills. And I was very skeptical. And I was invited to attend by the Joint Terrorism Task Force up in New York City. So it piqued my interest. I went and I attended Amy Herman's presentation. And I, as an intelligence officer at the time, I was always looking for something that gave me an extra edge with our competition, right? Something that made me a better intelligence officer. And this was a small thing, but what Amy did is allow me to use art to hone my observation skills. And I recommended her book, and she's wildly successful. There was for her book, The Art of Perception. That was her first book. Her second book was just published, and that's the book I want to endorse. It's called Fixed: How to Perfect the Fine Art of Problem Solving. In this time, Amy uses art so we can think about the world differently. Leaders at multiple levels can help problem solve, but think in terms of art. So art is the vehicle to hone some additional skills. So I strongly recommend it. We've done, or certainly Amy's done, programs at the Spy Museum in the past, and worldwide she has now worked with multiple intelligence services as well as U.S. Special Operations, and I think it's a brilliant book, so I highly recommend it. Again, the title's called Fixed. So I think that wraps our program today. It has been an extraordinary day for us. I wish everybody a happy and healthy new year. I'm really excited about next month's Spy Chat as well. And I'll stay engaged with Ali, and we'll take some of those questions, and maybe we can get back to the audience and answer some of them in writing. I'll kick it back to you, Amanda, for any closing comments.
That's what I was going to say. Thank you so much, Ali. We will be sharing the questions we didn't get to because there were lots of them, and it's been so informative, and everyone just would like to be able to help and like to know more. Thanks everyone for attending today. If you want to know about next month's Spy Chat and other programs, check out the Spy Museum calendar. We have a very interesting happy hour, change of pace, about spies and comics and cocktails next week on Wednesday, the 26th at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And we'd love to see you there and at any of our other programs. And if you enjoy our programs and you want to consider making a donation, we would, of course, welcome that. Thanks everyone for being here. As Chris said, please stay well, keep well, and maybe someday we'll all see each other at the Spy Museum.